What's up, champs? Welcome to another episode of the Short Shifts Fantasy Hockey Podcast, brought to you by Keeping Karlsson. I'm your host, Jeremy Rosillo, and joining me tonight, my pal and yours, Derrick. Derrick, thanks for filling in on another night. This is going to be our only short shift show this week because I think there's like 3 games between now and when we'd normally do a Thursday show, so it'll be a nice long break. But how are you doing?
I'm doing okay, all things considered. Looking forward to tuning in to the All-Star weekend and then being disappointed, as is per my yearly tradition. It is in Toronto this year where I am located. I don't think I'll go to anything in person, but we'll throw on the draft, which is making a return this year. That should be fun. And then maybe some of the skills in the game and the PWHL showcase as well.
Yeah, the All-Star game. I went to the MLB All-Star game this year because it was in Seattle where I was located. And gotta say, I'm way more interested in the skills competition than the All-Star game itself, but I'll probably try to catch both of them on TV. They're usually a good time, a good way to spend my weekend. Well, with that said, let's get into our headlines, which all happen to be injuries and outjuries this week. First off, in Columbus, both of the Adams, Boqvist and Fantilli, are injured. Boqvist is back on the ice, so it seems like he'll be back sooner rather than later. Fantilli, it was a laceration, and he's not skating yet, although that only happened a couple nights ago. Any major things we can glean from this for fantasy, or do we just have to wait until they come back from the break and see where they both are?
I think in the meantime, focus on the Gaudreau line. Tonight it's Gaudreau, Jenner, Chinakhov, and Chinakhov has been really hot lately. Maybe, keep a Marchenko if he continues to be productive and Werenski on the back end. But otherwise, Columbus has been falling apart. There's been a lot of negative news stories recently about how the players have felt about management this year. So hopefully Fantilli and Boqvist heal up all right. Eventually Fantilli will be a star, but along with some other people we'll discuss tonight, that might not be this year, and this year it might not be worth holding on to them depending on your format.
You mentioned the Gaudreau-Chinakhov line. I can quickly pull up one of our hot streaks that we were going to discuss. Yegor Chinakhov has 5 points in his last 3 games and 7 in his last 6, all while playing 17 to 20 minutes time on ice. In his last 10, he also has a 7-shot game and a 6-shot game, but he also has 2 0-shot games. He seems very inconsistent, but has been getting much better deployment than he was at the beginning of the season. So, maybe worth a look. Again, they play tonight and then not again until next Saturday, so kind of hard to do anything when they're going to be off for the first 5 days of next week. Next up, unfortunately, Jack Quinn is hurt for, I believe, 8 weeks is the timeline. That's another guy that has a bright future ahead of him, but probably is a cut this year. Just too many young guns in Buffalo, and he's going to have to ramp back up after getting surgery.
Yeah, he had some really great chemistry lately with Cousins and Peterka, and while he's out, watch how their deployment changes. Could be good, could be bad.
Good point. Peterka especially, I think, could benefit from it, as he was often playing third-line type minutes. A more relevant fantasy injury tonight, Tomas Hertl was announced not playing today. The Sharks play both today and tomorrow. We don't know what his status is for tomorrow. I didn't see anything on what the injury specifically is. This came as kind of a surprise. With Hertl out, I'd be looking at Couture as the first-line center, and I believe William Eklund has been getting power play 1 minutes recently, but it's San Jose. That's kind of hard to find any value there.
Agreed. Another team like Columbus that's in the Celebrini sweepstakes, not in the run for the playoffs.
And one final injury, another young gun who had been recently starting to come on, Scott Perunovich, the first power play defenseman for St. Louis, got injured last game. Today, Parayko took over that job. Parayko's also been really good lately. I expect once Krug or Falk or Perunovich, one of them will be the longer-term power play guy, but Parayko's great for the peripherals, and if he's getting power play time, he'll chip in some more there. Anything you have to say about Perunovich or Parayko?
Yeah, Parayko's been great and really snuck up on a lot of us in terms of his value recently. A lot of minutes slogged, a lot of peripheral stats in addition to the points he's been getting. So he should be rostered everywhere, but check your shallow leagues just in case. He might still be sitting in free agency and you might be able to upgrade.
He's especially good for your blocks in some leagues. I mean, he's been putting up 4 or 5 blocks in most of his games recently. That's always good. Now on to some slightly happier news. Patrick Kane should be out on Wednesday, but back after the All-Star break. Just said he was taking it easy. Obviously, get Kane back in your lineup, bump down whoever is losing deployment or power play time because of that. Also, an interesting one here, Philip Grubauer has been off IR for Seattle for 3 games now. And he has backed up Joey Daccord in all 3 of them, including tonight's game in which Daccord has been announced as the starter. What do you think's going on with this situation? Are the Kraken finally doing the smart thing and playing their better goalie instead of their more expensive goalie?
Well, the way you say that betrays your bias as a fan. And my gut instinct is always to say follow the money when it comes to goaltending. And Seattle has a lot of money in term committed to Grubauer. I really doubt they are going to give up on him completely. It has happened before, like Jack Campbell, but my guess is they will try to find an opportunity to get him back in his groove. Daccord's been great, but maybe after the All-Star break, maybe he's, well enough to dress, but was not, they didn't see a reason to rush him back into a start before the All-Star break. So I would say, hang on to him if you still have him in your IR slot, or you've just activated him from IR. Give it until maybe after the All-Star break and see how the deployment shakes out then.
I agree with that. I think the most likely scenario is they work this back to a 50-50 type of thing. Follow the money works on goaltenders like 95% of the time, so I agree with you on that. I was a bit surprised one of Daccord's last 3 games was a 4-3 overtime loss in which he gave up 4 goals on only 18 shots. I was sure that Grubauer was going to get the next game after that. But they're doing what's working for the team. They're right in a playoff hunt. And you definitely could benefit from having 2 goalies hot and running when you're hunting a playoff spot. Last but not least, we've got William Karlsson got removed from IR despite the fact that Vegas doesn't play until next week. I know that probably kind of sucks if you were stashing him in fantasy. I'm pretty sure that means in Yahoo he is off the IR. But he'll be back for Vegas come Tuesday and possibly in a line 1 position because of Jack Eichel's injury. Either way, him and Stevenson will be centering the top 2 lines and he'll get at least 1 top quality winger in Vegas.
Yeah, keep an eye on that though. With Eichel out, it should be good, but pre-Karlsson's injury, he wasn't getting the greatest deployment, playing with like Nick Roy and more of a third line role for a while. He's still been valuable. He still scores. He still shoots. But just keep an eye on it. If the lines shake out that at some point later on that he is not in great deployment, he might no longer be worth holding at that point.
Definitely got to monitor the deployment on. I think when everybody's healthy, he's probably their 3rd-line center and getting minimal power play time. He also just doesn't have a skill set that often helps you in fantasy with a lot more passing than shooting. And also, Vegas is one of the higher games played teams currently, meaning they have less games coming up. Even next week, I think they play Tuesday, Thursday, and then are off Friday through Sunday. So it may be worth rotating him out then to get ahead of the eventual injury returns that push him down the lineup. We've got 2 hot streaks for you also, and then in the second half of the episode, we're going to bring back an old favorite segment. That's why we're bringing the hot streaks up before the ad break. First off, Jared McCann has 9 points in his last 6 games and 13 in his last 10. This is really exciting on the surface because this is exactly the player that everyone wants Jared McCann to be, the leading scorer on the Kraken, a point-per-game type of player. The interesting thing is, he's doing this with, honestly, very little ice time. He played less than 13 minutes last game. He's played between 13 and 16 a couple games, and the highest time on ice he has in his last 10 is 17:41, and I believe that was a game that went to overtime. He is getting true power play 1 type deployments. Seattle seems to be shying away from the 1A, 1B a bit recently, and he's shooting 2.5 times per game. Obviously, the 13 points in 10 games isn't sustainable, but do you think McCann's back on track as a 65 to 70 point scorer, maybe?
He's on track now for sure, and the problem with Seattle is that they are so democratic with their deployment and so many, reasonably talented forwards that they bounce around. But at least for now, ride him while he's hot, and depending on your format, if he cools down, it might be a hold or it might not be.
What's interesting to me about this hot streak is it actually coincides pretty well with the Matty Beniers injury. Before the injury, McCann was playing wing with Beniers at center, and since the injury, including the couple games Beniers has been back, McCann was centering the first line of Tatar and Eberle. So I just wonder if McCann's a bit more productive from that center slot, or if maybe with Beniers out there, he was playing a bit more conservatively to help his young centerman out. Something to keep an eye on if those lines shuffle, as they always do under Dave Hakstol. The other hot streak is a young defenseman. Thomas Harley has 6 points in his last 3 games and 10 in his last 10. He's been playing 22-ish minutes a night, and on a line with Miro Heiskanen when Heiskanen returned from injury. Obviously no power play 1 deployment anymore, but Thomas Harley is looking like the real deal right now. Is there any advice you have other than to keep him on your roster if you already have him?
I'd just be mindful of Heiskanen coming back. That was only on January 25th was his first game back. And in 2 games back, Heiskanen's had a goal, 2 assists, one of them on the power play, 4 shots in each game. Harley's been good, but Heiskanen coming back does sort of, at least numbers wise, make me distrust, his streak from the period when Heiskanen was out. So, keep an eye on it. He might keep it up, but he also might fall back a bit now that Heiskanen will be reclaiming at least some of his opportunity.
On the flip side, in those 2 games since Heiskanen returned, Harley has 3 goals and an assist on 9 shots in 2 games. But the big thing I'm noticing is that his power play time is down from 60-ish% power play 1 to 10% in one of the games and 0% in the other game. I think Harley may end up looking a bit more like a Devin Tays, where he's on a high-powered offense with a good partner, but not really getting the power play time or the peripherals enough to really be an obvious hold in fantasy. But he's a fun player to watch, and definitely keep an eye on him if this streak continues. With that, we'll take a short break and be right back. Welcome back, everyone. Due to popular demand, we're bringing back a segment that I believe Shams and Lewis did earlier this year, because I don't think I was on it. Permission to Drop. We're going to run through a list of, I think it's between 23 and 25 players. I forget how many we cut. That may or may not be slightly over-owned. We're going to list their cupful ownership percentage, and I'm going to try to give you their average points per game over the last 30. And Derrick and I are going to tell you whether or not we give you permission to drop this player. The first 2 are a pair of Ottawa Senators. Vladimir Tarasenko is 100% owned in cupful and averaging 4.07 fantasy points per game over the last 30 days. And Josh Norris is 98% owned in cupful, and he's only averaging 3.08 fantasy points per game over the last 30 days. Would you be cutting either of these Senators, Derrick?
So I'll start by saying I'm going to give 2 answers on these players and every player. And one is going to be the cupful answer, a deep, offense-heavy scoring league. And the second answer is going to be more in tune with a shallower, maybe 10 to 12 team categories league where hits and blocks matter. And so for these 2, I'm going to tell you, hold Norris in both. He's been getting a lot of, he gets more hits and blocks and more time on ice recently than Tarasenko. Tarasenko, I would hold in cupful, but I would drop him in a shallow or Cats league, especially, depending on else is on your wire that might be interesting.
I'm on the side of, I agree with holding both in Cupful. I would be cutting both in a shallower league, just with Norris being a pure center, and the Sens kind of democratizing their top 9. Don't see much use in holding him in a 10 to 12 team league, although the hits are very nice. Next up we have Shane Gostisbehere, 96% owned in Cupful, but despite being on Detroit's Power Play 1, he's been on a bit of a cold streak lately. I think when I looked, he was between 2.5 and 3 fantasy points per game over the last 30 days. I must have forgot to add him to my tab list. But would you be dropping Shane Gostisbehere?
I would be dropping him in both. His stat sheet recently does show a few hits and blocks, but really that's never been his bread and butter. And I think given the other good defenders in Detroit, the chances of him, really erupting back to being a really solid value option, I think are low. I don't see him being a top D at any, point going forward. I think, his best case is to kind of maintain what he's been doing, and that's on the edge of, I would say, being rosterable.
Yeah, his last 30 days is only a 2.75 in Cupful, which is well into streamer territory. The odd thing is, in those last 30 days, he has a bunch of assists. So, if he's getting, 5 assists every 10 games and still only a 2.75, that's kind of hard to hold on to. I think I'm cutting him. Maybe if you're a team that's starved for defense, he's fine as a third or fourth defenseman. He is still playing Power Play 1 in Detroit, so that's also okay to me. Next up we have Tom Wilson. He's 96% owned in Cupful, and over the last 30 days, he is only a 2.61 fantasy points per game played. He's really gone cold in that Washington offense, while guys like Strome and Oshie have turned it on.
So I would hold him in both, or if he is dropped, I would pick him up. I wouldn't pay a lot, but Washington has a really good off-night schedule the rest of the season through the first round of the fantasy playoffs, and Wilson did have a really productive period at the start of the year. Washington's been a little all over the place this year. It's possible Wilson could bounce back a bit. So I would hold or pick him up if he's available, but it wouldn't be a firm hold.
I'm also holding or picking up Wilson. I think I would prioritize Wilson below the 2 caps I mentioned earlier, Strome and Oshie, but he's going to turn it around, and obviously in your shallower categories leagues, his hits and penalty minutes are absolute gold for the standard Yahoo format, so I would definitely consider picking him up even in the shallower leagues. Actually, I may be more interested in him in a league that counts penalty minutes than in Cupful, even if it's a bit shallower. Next up, Luke Hughes is 94% owned in Cupful, but over the last 30 days, he's only a 2.16 in fantasy points per game played. I cut Luke Hughes actually a long time ago, and someone in my division spent more than half of their free agent budget on it. I just don't see a player who's going to put up enough points to make up for his lack of shots, hits, and blocks. Actually, it's kind of similar to what Quinn Hughes was every year until this year, basically. Luke would need to pace 65 to 70 points to be worth putting on a Cupful roster, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would drop him in anything non-keeper. His Cupful rostership is likely being buoyed by his last name and his pedigree, his potential. But this period without Hamilton in the lineup should be his best. That should be the peak of what he can do, but it's still unimpressive, as you noted. So if anything, go grab Simon Nemec, who's also a young, defenseman in New Jersey, who has the same season average stats, like the whole season average per game, same stats, except a whole extra block per game. And Nemec has been much better recently than Hughes. So not that, even Nemec is maybe rosterable in all formats, but he probably is more rosterable than Hughes for this year.
Next up, Logan Thompson is 91% owned still. I assume that's people kind of trying to figure out what Vegas is doing with Adin Hill. I would be cutting Thompson because I'm pretty sure that Hill is going to be the 2/3 type starter there. If it's a 50-50, you could justify holding him, I think, because he's been really good when he does start.
Yeah, that's a clear drop in Cupful for a timeshare goalie. In a categories league, I would say it's a clear hold because, for most of the season when both he and Hill were healthy, the workload was maybe 60-40, maybe even 55-45. Thompson's still been really good. I think Hill will get a chance to run with a few starts maybe, but overall, Vegas is still good. As I've said before on the show, I would hang on to Thompson in a categories league.
Those ratios are going to be really good behind the Vegas team. So yeah, even if you're only getting 1.5 starts a week out of him, probably worth it in a shallower categories league. Another 91% owned player is Filip Hronek, who is averaging 3.05 fantasy points per game, which again is kind of below my cut line. He had a hot start with partner Quinn Hughes, but has kind of cooled down to that 3.05 over the last 30 days. Would you be cutting him or holding on to him here?
So I actually would hang on to him in Cupful. I think that, there's enough value there in a very high-powered Vancouver offense. And I think, at this point of the season, Vancouver is going for, historic levels of production in points and goals scored for a bunch of their players. So Hronek could definitely benefit from that. I would drop him in a categories league, though, where I don't think his peripherals are worthwhile.
I agree with you on both of those. He's actually pointless in his last 7 games, and with how many goals Vancouver scores and how much ice time he gets, that's not going to last forever. Next up, we've got Johnny Gaudreau, who is 87% owned in Cupful, but only averaging 2.54 fantasy points per game played over the last 30 days. That especially hurts because Columbus hasn't played a lot of games over the last 30 days. I definitely think you're snoozing if you're still holding on to Gaudreau in Cupful. He just doesn't shoot enough. You're probably dreaming about that 99-point season in Calgary. And in Cats leagues, even worse, he doesn't get hits or blocks or any other peripherals.
Yeah, I would drop him in a Cats league for sure. He's never been a big shooter, hitter, blocker. But in Cupful, I would hold him because, as Columbus is sort of falling apart, like we mentioned, he's the one of, reliable offensive rock, reliable in quotes maybe. Any scoring that happens in Columbus is likely to be revolving around him and his line. I would hang on to him, I think at this point still in Cupful. But, maybe like some others, it's a tenuous hold still at this point.
Another guy with similar history to Johnny Gaudreau with one big season and hasn't been the same since. 85% owned Jonathan Huberdeau is actually averaging 4.09 Cupful points per game played over the last 30 days, which is in the rosterable territory, in my opinion. Would you be cutting Huberdeau or holding on to him like Gaudreau?
Yeah, I actually would be cutting Huberdeau in pretty much any league, which is really disappointing, again, given recent history and his success in Florida. But, it's been 6 weeks since his last game with more than 3 shots. He's averaging only 1.5 shots a game recently. His ice time is back down. He's been getting a few points, but it just doesn't seem, if this is the best he's got at this point and he's barely at 4 points, Cupful points, that's not really enough to justify keeping him, especially because Calgary has among the fewest off-night games left this season. So, even if he's just barely on your roster, he's likely not going to be in your active lineup because he only is playing on those busy nights.
The off nights are a good point. I think I'm slightly more interested in holding on to Huberdeau than Gaudreau, but especially in categories leagues, they're both completely cuttable if it's more shallow than Cupful. If I'm taking a long-term bet on who's going to help my team most for the next month and a half, I'd take Huberdeau, but I'm not really attached to either one of these. Last but not least, in our trio of players you may remember from previous seasons, Pierre-Luc Dubois, also with another French-sounding name. Maybe that's the comparison I'm finding here. He's only averaging 2.74 fantasy points per game played over the last 30 days. He's 79% owned. He had a stint on the top line in LA, but that seems to have stopped. And honestly, he's been bad all year. Are you fine cutting him loose too?
Absolutely. Cut him anywhere. His teammates even seem unhappy with him at this point. His ice time is down. I would not... It's crazy given how big a contract he just signed, but I would not be surprised if LA buys him out this summer. You know, his reputation is just in the tank at this point. It's just not working. I don't know what it is other than maybe his heart isn't in it, but it doesn't seem good.
Yeah, this is now his third team that he's had, we'll say, issues on. He certainly is giving a bit of prima donna vibes to me. I'm not sure what the buyout rules are or if that's even something LA would be able to do, but he certainly is not looking like the second-line center they expected him to be. Another defenseman that may be over-owned, Jake Walman is 79% owned, averaging 3.53 points per game played over the last 30. That's probably in the ownable range. I haven't looked too deep into the advanced stats. What did you have prepared for this, Derrick?
I would cut him in cupful, just not enough offense, but I would hold him in a categories league. He's still getting lots of blocks.
Yeah, those blocks are kind of valuable for cupful, though, so I think I kind of have him in the Hronek category where he's playing with the other top defenseman on the team and is getting enough ice time that I guess he's going to do something, but he's probably one of those guys that is a third or fourth defenseman on a moderately good fantasy team and is a cut for someone who's leading their division. Next up, Beniers is 77% owned. He's only averaging 2.02 points per game played over the last 30. That does include a stint on the IR, so there's only 7 games in that sample size. Do you have hopes for Beniers, or is this just a sophomore slump season and you gotta let him go?
Unfortunately, I think you gotta let him go. In any non-keeper format, I think he's still pure C. I don't think he's gotten any eligibility added. And, just really not been, like we said earlier, Seattle is really spreading the love in terms of offensive deployment and line combinations. And his has never, been the best this year. So it may be the best one day, but this year I think it's a drop.
Agreed. Bright future, but not helping you this year. So you can let him go and fill that with a streamer or a better player. Cam Talbot is 72% owned and has been cut a lot recently, with David Rittich stealing some starts, although Rittich has also been bad lately. LA's in some trade rumors revolving around goalies. Are you okay cutting Talbot?
Yeah, drop him for sure. Part of this terrible LA tailspin, and, he's never had the most reliable track record as a volume starter before. So yeah, I wouldn't see a reason to hang on to him right now.
I kind of want whoever's starting for LA because they have a really good schedule the next 4 weeks or so. Just a lot of 4-game weeks and a couple of off nights. But yeah, I'm not going to put my faith in Talbot. I think at this rate, they're desperate enough. They're just going to 50-50 it until they trade for a goalie. 64% owned. Evan Rodrigues, only 2.68 over the last 30 days, despite being on that top line with Barkov. I think this is Jake DeBrusk syndrome, where DeBrusk spent so many years as the third wheel on that top line and never put up fantasy relevant numbers until the 1 year that he did. I'm fine cutting Rodrigues. He's a guy I'm going to constantly go back to stream, but I just can't justify holding a roster spot on him.
Yeah, and interestingly, Florida really switched up their line since Barkov came back. They kind of have Barkov, Tkachuk, and Reinhart all on different lines. And yeah, Rodrigues hasn't been, really proving himself to be valuable even with Barkov. So I would definitely be cutting him right now, but keeping an eye in case things change. Okay.
Travis Sanheim is 60% owned in cupful and only 2.08 points per game played over the last 30. Are we snoozing here?
Drop him. Philadelphia's back into what we expected preseason to be them in a free fall. And he had a really great period there, but for right now, I think it's a drop.
Yeah, he's lost power play 1 to some of the rookies and to Jamie Drysdale, even though I don't even know who's on power play 1 because it's changed like 5 times in the last 2 weeks. He's also lowered his time on ice. He's not really playing 26, 28 minutes a game like he was early in the season when he was kind of carrying the team. He had a good run, but you can get rid of him now. Another goalie I don't know what to do with, Vitek Vanecek, 53% owned. He's kind of been ceding starts to Dawes, who has also been bad. Are you cutting Vanecek?
So I think if you still have him at this point, I would hold through the All-Star break and see what happens, right afterward. Dawes' 3 bad games in a row recently, I think might give Vanecek some leash to win the starting job back. Now, if, like LA, New Jersey trades for another goalie, then it might be a drop, but for now, I would hold and see.
This is kind of another case of follow the money. Like, Vanecek's getting the most money of the 3 goalies in New Jersey, so until they trade for someone, which I'm less convinced they will than LA will, I think he's probably just going to be the default starter unless someone else has an insane run. Another New Jersey Devil, Dawson Mercer, 51% owned, 3.01 fantasy points per game played over the last 30. I'm fine cutting him.
I'm fine cutting him and pretty much everyone else we're going to mention from this point out.
Yeah, we're kind of trending down towards the name values that aren't really owned in a ton of leagues, but are kind of at the top of your free agency list because they had hot streaks at some point. Darcy Kuemper, 36% owned. I think you're snoozing if you're holding him. It looks like Charlie Lindgren is going to get the majority of the starts in Washington, and I think this is one of the cases where follow the money doesn't make sense because regardless of the money, both guys are veterans and I believe on slightly longer term contracts, and the Caps are absolutely desperate to win every game to fight for playoff position. Next up, we've got Matias Maccelli in Arizona, 28% owned, only averaging 2 points per game played over the last 30. What do you think about him?
So this will be the last person on the list that I will say to hold, and that's because Arizona has the best off-night schedule for the next month. Maccelli has been valuable at times. He can probably get in your active roster and be valuable for you between now and the start of playoffs.
Yeah, I'm still cutting Maccelli personally. Just he doesn't shoot or hit or block enough, and he only gets assists. I can't count how many nights I've had him on my roster, see that he gets a point, and realize that he got 1 assist and 3.0 cupful points, which isn't enough for me to want to roster him if he's not getting multiple points per game. He is kind of on that borderline, though, especially, like you mentioned, the off-night schedule. I believe Yahoo Week 18, Arizona has the Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday schedule, which is always nice to have guys on that team for. 23% owned, Andrei Kuzmenko, Nino Niederreiter, cut them both, not much else to say. Jacob Slavin, 21% owned, fine cutting him. Do you have any additional comments on those 3?
Agreed. Kuzmenko has been discussed a lot recently. Nino's probably the one of those 3 that I would have the most sympathy for. He's streaky and could bounce back to some value, but as of right now, it hasn't been working for him in Winnipeg lately.
Yeah, Nino could have value if Winnipeg shuffles up their lines and gets healthy and all that. Kuzmenko's been in some Chicago trade rumors. Apparently it's a trade that could help both Chicago be more exciting and Vancouver shed some salary. If he ends up in Chicago as Bedard's winger, maybe, that seems more interesting than the questionable deployment he's been getting recently in Vancouver, but I would be cutting him until literally Elliot Friedman or whoever else breaks that trade news. And that was our list of permission to drop players. I hope at least one of these guys is on your team and you got some info from this. I'd be surprised if there are many people who do not roster or have in free agency any of these guys. Real quick, speaking of free agency, while I was researching this, I had up the Cupful ownership percentage across all, I believe, 51 Cupful leagues. Here are a list of players who are available in at least one division that everybody should go check and make sure it is not their division because they should be owned. Dylan Strome, TJ Oshie, Philip Gustafsson, Arturi Lehkonen, Colton Parayko, Gabriel Velarde, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, Logan Couture, and Ross Colton are all guys that are available in 1 to 3 cupful leagues, and just make sure it's not your league and add them quickly. Actually, I pulled it up again, and I noticed Connor Ingram is on that list. I'd be adding him also, unless I have like 5 goalies already.
None of them available in my Tier 4 small land, shout out. But if they're in yours, give them a look.
Yep, same with my Tier 2 San Jose. None of them are available, but a couple of them are on my roster, so maybe that's why I'm recommending them. And with that, thank you for joining us. Be sure to give us a follow at ShortShiftsKK, as well as Brian and Elon at Keeping Karlsson. Please use www.gamedaytweets.com to get all the best info from Twitter without having to actually go to Twitter. It includes team by team and searchable tweets by player name. Visit that site and the other great sites we use to research our episodes with at Yahoo, Frozen Tools, ShiftChart.com, Icy Data, and Natural Stat Trick. Our intro and outro music was created by Pat Roach, and John Reed is our digital media producer. Until we see you next time, play smart and keep your shifts short.